to-do app series where we are trying to reproduce a simple to-do app that was created by a user on GitHub. This was done in code, and we're looking to recreate the same to-do application using the Hippie no-code editor. So in the last video, we demonstrated how you would connect the plus button so that when the user presses that button or taps that button, we show this dialog that asks the user to enter a title, a description, and have a button to press save. In this video, we're going to take a look at what happens when the user presses save, or how you create the logic for the user pressing save. When the user presses save, we'd like to store these text fields, or the contents of these text fields, on the server so that we can later display them. To do this, Hippie has, if we go to the logic panel, to do this, Hippie has the query block. Right, so we start out by creating an event, which I've done here, and selecting the save button as the event source. So if I was to edit that and do it again, you just select the elevated button as the source of the event and click in the onPressed event, so that when the save button is pressed, we're going to execute the logic that we're going to create on this screen. And the logic that we need is the ability for us to save whatever data the user has put into our text fields. So let's connect this query block, and what we need in this case is a mutation. A mutation query is used to be able to create data, update, delete, any kind of operation that ends up changing the data on the server is a mutation. Any query which only fetches data without making any changes is a query. So if we select mutation, there are several built-in mutations available. And one that we need for this particular operation is the upsert. Upsert allows you to be able to create updates and update data. So there isn't a separate insert and update method. If you're familiar with CRUD operations, Hippie just has a single upsert, and if you provide the ID of an existing item in your upsert, then if an object doesn't exist with that ID, Hippie will create it. If an object exists with that ID, then Hippie will update the item, the existing item. So we select the upsert, and that gives us an area that allows us to basically create objects on the server using the upsert. To do that, you need to tell Hippie what type of object you would like to create or update. And in this case, we already, in the previous video, created the object that we would like. So in the data model, we already created a to-do item. If you recall from the previous video, we went to collections and we created this to-do item. So this is how this then comes into play in your logic later on. Now, before I get too much into this, there are a couple of things that's worth pointing out in the query block. At the top, it gives you response, status code, and authorization token. We haven't done authorization token yet because we haven't talked about creating users or logging in, etc. For this to-do app. But normally you would have a user register into the application, and when they log in, Hippie returns a token to you, and you would store that token in a device variable. So Hippie will then store that token on the user's device. So if it's a mobile phone or even in the browser, it will get stored in a persistent way so that you can retrieve it and use it in subsequent queries. We'll work around that for now because we're not going to implement create account and log in for this series. We'll do that in a separate video series. The other two, basically response, gives you the ability to store the response from the server in a variable. So if you were doing a query rather than a mutation, you might be interested in the data that comes back from the server. If you want to be able to access it, you need to store it somewhere. So you would use a you'd use a constant to basically say, I want to store my my response in a variable called response, for example. And that then allows you to access that data in another step later on so that you can use it. If you're also interested in the status code, so that you could perhaps show different error messages depending on the status code that comes back from the query, then you could put another variable here, and Hippie will basically give you that status code in that variable. So if you look at the documentation, when you hovers, it tells you exactly what I've just explained here. But basically, yeah, you're storing the response and the status code into a variable. Now, this is a general thing with Hippie's blocks. Wherever you see this white area, it's basically an area where you can add a child block, and it typically indicates where you can provide a constant or a variable. In the case, for example, of the authorization token, right, I mentioned that you would normally have that in a device variable. What I mean by that is you have the ability to fetch data from variables. And if you're not familiar, a variable is basically an area that allows you to store information that you can retrieve and use later on. So in this case, we're storing a variable in what we've called a local variable. But there are different types of variables. A local variable means that it is only accessible on this canvas. And the canvas at the moment is specific to the widget that's currently selected. So when we started this video, I'd already selected the top level widget of the component, all right? And so it means that all of the logic that we're creating here is specific to this top level widget. If I was to select column, for example, you see it looks like it's disappeared, but it's not. It's just because the logic that we were working on is specific to this top level widget that I was working with at the start of the video. Now, in our case, we'll need to get a token and hard code some value in here. All right. For now, just put some random string in here. That does mean that our create won't work to begin with until we put a valid token in there. But we'll just go through and show you how you would put the rest of this together. All right. With that explained, there are effectively three pieces to the query block in Hippie. At the top, we've got these pieces that we've just explained, and then you have inputs. The input area is where you would provide information that you are sending to the server. In our case, we're going to send a to-do item object to the server and ask the server to create that when the user has pressed the save button. The third part of a query block is the fields that you would like to fetch from the server. And the fields that you would like to fetch depend on the method that you've selected and what that method returns. It tells you here that the upsert method returns a hippie object. Now, if you chose a different endpoint, for example, trash, you can see it changes to an int, and that says that the trash endpoint is going to return an integer that indicates how many items were trashed in that request. Let's go back to our upsert for now. And so because this returns a hippie uh, object, we have to select at least one field from the data that's returned by this. So in this case, we're going to select the ID, all right? But you could just as well select other fields. So if we wanted to know the created date of the object that we're about to create, then you can basically tell the server to return that to you, and that's a part of the hippie object. Now, in the data that we're sending to the server, we have to provide the two fields. If you recall from our model, so let's go back to the collections for a second. Our model, in our model that we created in, I believe, the first video in this series, we created a title and we created a description. All right, so we need to provide at least the title because the title is required, and we chose to make that required when we created that model. So if we go back to the logic, no, so the logic for the component is what we need. So the creates to do item component. It's worth pointing this out. So when you go to the logic panel, it shows you the logic for the UI that you're currently looking at on the canvas. So in this case, where we have the to-do component, now that I've opened the to-do component, if I go to the logic panel, it shows me the logic associated with that to-do component. If I went there from the screen, it would show me the logic from the screen. All right. So now we have our to-do item, and we want to tell the server that the title of the to-do item is coming from our text field. And again, you can see this empty white area. It means you need to fill this in. You need to provide the value that's going into this spot. Okay. We need a second one for the description. So to-do item. Did I miss something? We'll come back to that. That may be a bug. So the to provide the title, we'll ignore description for now. Not sure why it's not showing up. I'll just remove that and continue. So to provide the title, we need to tell Hippie to take the title from our text field, and what we'll do is we'll rename this text field so that they're easier to know. So this text field is title, and this text field is the description. Just call it disk. And if we switch back, okay, so now we need to get the value of our text field. You go to variables and you use a get variable, and you put the get variable into that empty white area. Remember, wherever you see these empty white areas, that's where you need to fill something in. You need to provide a value in that spot, and you can fetch that value from different places. In this case, we'd like the value of a widget. Okay, so the value that we're going to provide is coming from our text field widget. So we'll select the widget property, And in other videos, we'll explain the other types that are available. But for now, if you select widget property, it allows you to select the widget. And in this case, we like the title. And specifically, we like the data property. You can see that there are a lot of other properties on the text field, and you can both set and get all of these properties to control your application in very fine level detail. But for now, we just want the data from the text field. So in this query, in this block that we've built up, we've basically said when the elevated button, when its unpressed event is fired, we'd like to create a request that will be sent to the server, and that request is the upsert mutation, all right, and we'd like to store the result of the upsert in the response variable, and we'd like to use the token that we've provided here as the authorization token. As an input to the upsert request, we would like to create an object. So we use the object field under data, and we'd like to create an object of type to-do item. And in that to-do item, we would in the to-do item that we are creating, we would like to set the title of the to-do item to the value of the title text field, and we want to take the data property from that title text field and set it to the title of our data model that we're sending to the server. Then from the object that's returned from the server, we'd like the server to send us the ID and the created date of the to-do item. Okay, now in doing this, we have just created the logic to create a to-do item. It won't work right now because we don't have a proper authorization token. We'll get one prepared for the next video and be able to demonstrate this actually executing and creating to-do items that we can display in the subsequent video that will follow.